In one of my previous videos, I covered a workflow on how to create a print style website, and that video broadly went over everything from brainstorming to the execution. And I wanted to create a video that focused a little more on moving things out of Affinity and into Figma, and also show some of the gotchas that I ran into along the way. So let me show you how I did that. All right, so I want to start off by going over how I set up my document in Affinity. The first thing we're going to look at is the document setup. I have my units set to pixels, and I have the DPI set to 72. I have my page width and page height set here, width to 1440 pixels and page height to 900 pixels. So these are the values that I use in Figma also. 1440 is what I like using in Figma when designing for desktop. And 900 I just chose as a size for this hero section. That can change depending on the section you're trying to design to, but I typically like to keep the page width at 1440 for my desktop designs. So the next thing I like to set up in my Affinity documents is my columns and rows. Since I like designing on a modular grid, it makes it easier for me to transfer things from Affinity over to Figma and keep the same positioning that I had in my Affinity document. So to set those up, if you go to View and select Margins and Guides, you'll see here you can set up columns and rows and your gutter. I have mine set up to 12 columns and 12 rows with a gutter of 10 pixels. And I have a margin set of 40 pixels around this whole section. To view those columns and rows on your document, if you just select the View menu and under Show, there's columns and guides. You can just select that and it'll check it on, and you can see the columns and rows that were set in the previous settings here. So you could set up whatever values you want for columns and guides. It doesn't have to be 12 and 12 like I have set up here. That's just what I like using. But if you have different settings that you prefer, you can go ahead and use those. I'll show how you set them up in Figma also so that the two documents will match. So I have a blank Figma document here. I'll show you how to set this up from scratch. So I start with a frame, and here's where that 1440 value comes from, is the desktop frame here. You'll notice that the height is set to 1024 by default. That's okay, since the height of the page will change as you add more sections. So to set up that section, I like to create another frame. You could either click the frame icon or hit F on your keyboard. And that ends up becoming the size of the Affinity document. So we want this to be 1440 by 900 also. That way we can use the rows and columns within this frame. So to do that, if you go to the layout guide while that frame is selected, you can go ahead and select columns. We can do columns first. In Figma, it's a little different because you have to do both of them separately. But you'll go ahead and select the count to 12 and the margin to 40 and the gutter to 10, just like we had in Affinity. And that gets you your columns. And to do the rows, you'll hit the plus icon in this layout guide section and select rows. And then once you click the settings within there, you'll be able to change the count. So these are 12 also, with a margin of 40 and a gutter of 10. And now Figma has the same modular grid that we have set up in Affinity. So we'll be able to use this to position things in the places that we want them to match the layout. The nice thing about having this in its own frame also is we can change the height of this page, and this grid will always stay intact. And if you wanted to save those settings, you could go in here and create a style out of it by hitting this plus icon, and we'll just call it something like 12 by 12. And if you wanted to hide those, when you have the frame selected, if you just hit Shift G, those will disappear, so you can quickly show and hide those within the frame. One thing I want to go over is how I set up my assets. So I like to create a folder structure that gets shared between the two files. That includes any photography that may be used in the layout, textures, and any vector art. So if I have a set of UI icons that I want to use, I would put them in this vector folder. So this folder ends up becoming my single source of truth for both files. If I'm doing any exporting from one file that I'm going to import into the other, it always goes into this main assets folder in one of these subfolders. For example, the texture image that I'm using in the background of this layout here, I have inside my assets folder in the textures folder. So there's this photocopy image. So having this one assets folder makes it easy for me to reuse assets in Figma also if I need to. When you need to start moving things from Affinity over to Figma, there's a couple of options you have for moving vector elements over. So the simplest way is to just grab a vector element that you have and just do a copy and paste into Figma. That's one option. The other option is if you wanted to export it into a file into your assets folder, you can go into File and Export. And by default, it's going to try and export the whole document here. So you'll probably see this at first, but you need to go into this area and click on Selection Only, and then it will only export what you have selected. So from here, you can select SVG for export, and I'm just using the default settings here. And then once you select export, you can name it what you want and then save it into your vector folder. For me personally, I like using the copy and paste method since I've noticed that the export of SVGs from Affinity gets a little messy. And I'll show you what I mean by that when I copy and paste this in, because there is a little bit of cleanup that has to be done on these SVGs when they're exported out of Affinity. So I'm going to take this logo as an example and just do a copy. I'm going to go here to my Figma file and just do paste. And you'll see that it's in here. You'll notice that it puts it in a frame. And then there's a group under here. Then it has the name of the group that I had in my Affinity file. So what I usually do, and this is what I mean by doing a little bit of cleanup, is I end up ungrouping these so that it's just the group that I initially had in my Affinity file. Sometimes when Affinity exports vectors, it'll create extra groups around each vector line. And I usually ungroup those to keep the vector clean. But in this instance, it kept it all clean without creating those extra groups. So this is how I would end up leaving it in my Figma file. And if I enable the grid, I can just position this logo into where I had it in my Affinity file. So I do want to walk through an issue that I found when exporting vectors from Affinity that have had warp effects applied to them. So this middle design here had some warp effects. So if I just copy and paste that over into Figma, when you look into these groups, you'll see it created an extra nested group and it just has this image icon. So it looks like Figma rasterized it. When you zoom in, you'll see the pixels, and we don't want that. This is vector art. So I found there's a workaround that you have to do. And I don't know if this is a bug in Affinity, but I'll show you the trick that worked for me. So in Affinity, what I found is if you ungroup the layer and then group it again, I'll name this something like warped, and then you do the copy. When you paste that into Figma, you'll notice that now it created all these individual groups. And this is what I was talking about, that sometimes these groups get created when they're exported from Affinity. Looking at the Affinity file, you'll notice there are no groups where those curves are. So there's something in the export process that happens from Affinity, and this is what I mean of doing a little bit of cleanup. One way to get rid of those is just select all of them and just ungroup, and you'll go back to vector curves. But you'll also notice that we don't have that rasterized image. It actually brought the vector. So yeah, I don't know if it's a bug in Affinity, but ungrouping and regrouping happens to fix that issue. So if you see that raster image icon in Figma, you may want to try that first if you're not getting the full vector transferred over. If you find that isn't working doing the ungroup and group, you can always go to the layer and select it. So if you go to File Export and we go back and make sure that we have Selection Only selected in this dropdown, then we can export it as an SVG, and then that could be dragged into Figma manually. So let me export this one to show you how that would work. So if we just name this warped also. Go ahead and delete this one, and bringing vector into Figma from SVG files, you can just drag it in. So those are the two ways you can bring in your SVGs. So moving text over is a little bit more of a manual process. There is no way to export your text settings in Affinity and import them into Figma. That has to be recreated. So looking at this first piece of text, I would just recreate this in Figma. So I'll just create a text item, and I already have it set with the same font and sizes. So one thing about the sizes, because of the way the document is set up, when it's set to 72 dpi, that means 1 point and 1 pixel are 1 for 1. So in Affinity, my units are set to points. You can change it to pixels if you wanted to. So if you go to Affinity in settings, there's this user interface section, and there's a checkbox in there to show text in points. If you uncheck it, then it'll show it in the unit you've selected. This point value will be the same in Figma. I just have it rounded up, so I have it set to 176 here, and it matches the same size that I have set up in Affinity. So when it comes to the effect, the blur effect, in Affinity, I'm using a Gaussian blur, and I'll show you how that's different in Figma. So in Affinity, the Gaussian blur, you'll see that the setting here is set to 7 pixels. That's not a 1 for 1 in Figma, since in Figma, we'll use a layer blur effect. So if I select the text and go down to effects, I can select layer blur. And if I set that to 7, you'll see that that blur is a lot less than what is in the Affinity document. So what I found is in Figma, it's closer to double. So if I select 14, that's a lot closer to what I have in the Affinity document. Copying larger blocks of text, you'll want to take the text itself and recreate this in Figma also. Because if you just do a copy and paste here from Affinity and paste it into Figma, it will look right and it'll be the right sizes. But when you dig further in and look, it creates separate lines for each line of text. So for text like this, where it wraps and it's a single paragraph, that's not ideal. So you wouldn't want to use that technique there. If it was just a single line of text, you could do that. But for wrapping text, you don't want to copy it straight out of Affinity. So what I'll do instead is I'll just create a text block, and I'll copy in the text manually. So for the nav, since I would probably make this into a reusable component, I would just copy over one and paste it in. And for this one, you'll see there is no text. So I'll ungroup these frames. You'll see it pops up there. And I just want to go in here and clean up some of this. And you'll see I have a text item here. And when I select it, it has the right values, but it's not showing that way. And this just may be a bug with the import, but if you click into the text, you'll see it changes size. So if you notice anything like that, it may just be a bug or something that gets lost in the transfer from Affinity to Figma. Okay, so now that I have the nav in there as components, the remaining thing I have to do is adding the texture. And what I'll do is I'll just add that as a background fill to this frame that I have in here. And now I have everything in here that I had in my Affinity file. And then from here, you can build out the rest of your sections. So you could choose to either use Affinity to create some of the other sections, or you could just design directly here in Figma. But those are the steps that I take to get something from Affinity over into Figma. From here, I'd probably finish the rest of the design in Figma, since I typically use Affinity for more of the custom vector artwork, or if I'm trying to get more creative with something. And I use Figma as my final delivery file to the development team, so I focus more on the functionality there and the layout. But if you want to see how I used Affinity to create multiple sections on a website and bring those together in Figma through animated transitions, then I'll link that video here so you can watch that.